two titans locked in history's deadliest chess match. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49 BC, he ignited a civil war that would drench Rome in blood. Watch as the conqueror of Gaul outmaneuvers Pompey the Great across battlefields from Spain to Egypt. Experience the desperate clash at Pharsalus, where Caesar's veterans shattered Pompey's cavalry, and witness the betrayal that left the Republic's defender dead on an Egyptian shore. Though Caesar triumphed over every rival, his ultimate victory contained the seeds of his own destruction. Discover how one man's ambition forever transformed Rome. The forum seethed with noise. Hawkers cried their wares, advocates thundered their cases, and gangs of youths shouted in the pay of rival politicians. In that feverish atmosphere, three men learned that together they could bend Rome itself. Gaius Julius Caesar, the conqueror of Gaul in the making, was still burdened by debt but armed with unmatched ambition. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, hailed by every citizen as Pompey the Great, had returned from the east with fame, yet found himself blocked by senators who withheld land from his veterans. Marcus Licinius Crassus, called by all the richest man in Rome, possessed wealth vast enough to buy senators, but still longed for the military glory that would place him beside the others in memory. Their bargain, forged more in necessity than in trust, became the private compact later known as the First Triumvirate. The arrangement worked because each brought what the others lacked. Pompey wanted farmland for thousands of hardened soldiers, and Caesar, as consul, drove the measure through despite obstruction. Crassus demanded relief for the equestrian tax farmers who bankrolled his ventures, and his partners ensured the law passed. In return, both men lent their influence to Caesar's rise, securing him command over Gaul and Illyricum once his consulship ended. It was politics reduced to its essence. Ambition, wealth, and military power blended together in a way the Republic could not resist. When Caesar's year in office closed, the ambitious consul marched north. Many senators assumed he would spend his time pacifying border tribes. Instead, the new proconsul saw boundless opportunity. His first campaigns drove the Helvetii from their migrations. Next, he turned on Ariovistus the German, who had crossed the Rhine with swarms of warriors and crushed him in battle. Not content with victory, he built a wooden bridge across the mighty river, simply to show it could be done, then withdrew before German chieftains could strike back. His boldness astonished even his enemies. The years brought more triumphs. The Belgae, proud and warlike, were subdued after fierce resistance. Twice he crossed the Channel to Britain, a land only whispered about in taverns, and finally came the siege of Alesia. There, Vercingetorix united the Gallic tribes in revolt. But Caesar's engineers built vast earthworks, a ring of timber and ditch that hemmed the defenders inside. When Gallic relief forces attacked, they found themselves facing another wall, this one turned outward. For weeks, Romans fought starvation and assaults on both sides. In the end, Vercingetorix laid down his arms, and Gaul was lost to its people. From that day, Caesar was not merely governor, he was legend. Back in Rome, Pompey watched these events with unease. Once, his victories in the east had seemed the pinnacle of achievement. He had cleared the seas of pirates, humbled kings, and reorganized provinces. Now, while he remained in the capital, his younger ally grew into something more than mortal in the eyes of the crowd. Yet rivalry was softened by marriage. Caesar had given his daughter Julia to Pompey, and unlike most political unions, theirs carried genuine affection. People admired the sight of the great general doting on his young wife, and the alliance seemed cemented by blood as well as ambition. But Crassus could not endure being overshadowed. The magnate, with riches that could drown the forum in silver, grew restless for recognition that money could never secure. He cast his gaze eastward to Parthia, dreaming of victories to rival Alexander. In 53 BC, he marched out with legions eager for plunder. At Cari, fortune betrayed him. Parthian cavalry swarmed the Romans, showering them with arrows until discipline broke. Crassus fell in the chaos, his head seized as a trophy, his army shattered. The richest man in Rome had become the ill-fated partner, and with his death, the triumvirate lost its balance. The shock in Rome was deep, but grief turned soon to calculation. With Crassus gone, only two remained. The fragile bond between Caesar and Pompey now depended almost entirely on Julia. But in that same year, tragedy struck again. Julia died in childbirth. Her passing devastated Pompey, who adored her, and left Caesar mourning the daughter who had been his dearest link to family. More than private sorrow, her death stripped away the last thread of kinship that had restrained rivalry. Without her, alliance became competition. The Senate seized its chance. Many aristocrats, jealous of Caesar's victories, whispered into Pompey's ear. They urged him to stand as the Senate's champion, guardian of tradition, against the proconsul who seemed drunk on conquest. Honors followed. He married into the house of Metellus Scipio, a union that tied him firmly to the conservative elite. Step by step, Pompey drifted from ally to adversary, until the partnership that had once held Rome together existed only in memory. Meanwhile, couriers carried Caesar's dispatches from Gaul, read aloud before crowds eager for news. Each letter spoke of fresh victories, captives, and spoils. Ordinary Romans cheered, hailing him as the victor at Alesia, the general who shared their hardships. But senators muttered darkly. His term as governor would end. Then he would face indictments for corruption and illegal warfare. To return without soldiers meant humiliation, perhaps exile. To cling to his legions meant defiance of the Republic itself. The dilemma grew sharper with each passing season. The city itself reflected the strain. Gangs loyal to Caesar fought those aligned with Pompey. Stones and daggers turned debates into riots, and magistrates dared not walk the streets without guards. Temples, once sanctuaries, saw blood spilled on their steps. The Republic no longer seemed ruled by law, but by the will of rival champions. To some, Caesar promised reform and renewal. To others, Pompey alone could preserve order. Ordinary citizens, caught between factions, whispered that civil war was already marching toward them. By 53 BC, the triumvirate had collapsed. Crassus lay dead in the eastern sands, Julia in her grave, and the two surviving giants faced each other across a widening gulf. Caesar commanded hardened legions in Gaul, bound to him by years of blood and hardship. Pompey stood in Rome, cloaked in legality, honored as the defender of tradition. What began as a partnership of ambition had become a rivalry fueled by fear and pride. The Republic, strained to breaking, braced for the storm that would follow. Blood pooled in the gutters of Rome as rival gangs fought beneath the shadow of temples older than the Republic itself. Knives flashed in the torchlight, stones hurled through smoky air, and bodies crumpled where senators had once walked with dignity. The names of two men echoed through this chaos: Clodius and Milo, political strongmen whose followers turned the capital into a battlefield. Their violence reflected more than personal rivalry. It embodied the unraveling order of a republic stretched beyond endurance. The violence reached its climax on the Appian Way. Clodius and Milo met by chance, and words quickly gave way to blades. Clodius was struck down, his body carried to the city by furious followers. The corpse was laid upon a pyre in the Senate house itself, and flames roared up. reducing Rome's central hall of power to rubble. Senators scattered in panic as smoke drifted across the forum. The Republic itself seemed to be burning with the body of the fallen tribune. Out of the ashes, Pompey was summoned. He had already been consul twice, had defeated pirates on the seas, and reorganized the provinces of the East. But now he was asked to take an unprecedented role, sole consul. No colleague would balance him, no veto could restrain him. At first he hesitated, aware that such a post might look like tyranny, yet chaos demanded action. In 52 BC, Pompey entered office alone. Soldiers patrolled the streets. Executions cowed rioters, and order was restored. For many Romans, it felt as though only one man stood between them and anarchy. While Pompey secured the city, Gaius Julius Caesar, the conqueror of Gaul, carried on his campaigns far to the north. His dispatches told of daring marches and impossible feats. He had crushed the Helvetii, driven Ariovistus and his Germans across the Rhine, and broken the Belgae. Twice he crossed the Channel to Britain, a land shrouded in myth. His crowning moment came at Alesia. There, Vercingetorix rallied Gaul in a final stand. Caesar's response was audacious. He built walls around the stronghold to starve it out, then raised another ring facing outward to block relief. His soldiers, hungry and exhausted, fought on two fronts until the Gauls collapsed. When the chieftain rode out in armor and surrendered, the Gallic dream ended. Rome roared with admiration. Crowds cheered Caesar's name in the forum, and coins minted with spoils filled purses across the city. But senators listened to his dispatches with narrowed eyes. A man with such victories, commanding soldiers who adored him, threatened the balance of the Republic. It was not treasure they feared, but loyalty, legions tied to one commander rather than to the Senate. Personal ties that once softened the rivalry had vanished. Julia, Caesar's daughter and Pompey's beloved wife, had died in childbirth. Her loss struck both households with grief, but in politics it carried greater consequence. The bond of kinship between the two giants was gone. Pompey remarried, this time to the daughter of Metellus Scipio, one of the most aristocratic families in Rome. The union tied him tightly to the conservative elite and confirmed what many suspected, that Pompey was drifting toward the Senate's side. From that moment, senators pressed harder. They hailed Pompey as the defender of tradition, the man chosen to protect liberty. Honors flowed his way. He sat as judge in trials, controlled grain supplies, and held the loyalty of the conservative bloc. Against him, they painted Caesar as a would-be tyrant. Rumors swirled that once his governorship expired, indictments would be launched. Charges of corruption, unlawful war, and even sacrilege. Caesar knew what awaited him. To return as a private citizen meant standing trial before enemies who had sharpened their knives for years. Exile or ruin loomed as certainty. His only shield lay in the men who had marched at his side. These veterans, bound to him by hardship, saw him not just as commander, but as comrade. They remembered nights in the mud when he walked among their tents, mornings when he shared their rations, and battles where he fought in the front rank. Their loyalty was not to the Senate, but to him. The city felt the tension rising. Grain shortages set off riots. Veterans settled in Italy clashed with urban gangs. Taverns sang songs praising Caesar's victories, while conservative households toasted Pompey as the protector of the state. Senators debated furiously. Some urged compromise. Others demanded Caesar disarm or face war. Each decree pushed both men further apart. Pompey, still cautious but now locked in place by honors and alliances, began raising new forces. Young recruits drilled on the Campus Martius, their polished armor gleaming under the sun. The Senate cheered, believing the veteran general could face his rival if defiance came. Caesar, watching from Ravenna, weighed every message with suspicion. He had 10 seasoned legions at his command, men tested by Gaul, hardened beyond anything Pompey's recruits had endured. To surrender them was unthinkable. As the year 50 BC closed, compromise seemed impossible. Pompey stood as Rome's lawful protector, commanding the Senate's favor. Caesar held the loyalty of the army, commanding the frontier. Between them stretched not only geography, but destiny. One winter night, as fires burned in the camps along the northern border, Caesar paced in silence. To obey the Senate meant humiliation, perhaps destruction. To resist meant civil war. In the capital, Pompey listened to reports of new levies and assured allies that Rome would endure. Neither man knew when the first step would be taken, only that it would come. The Republic was no longer balanced by alliance. It was being pulled toward conflict, and the world waited for the moment when silence would break into marching feet. Winter gripped the Italian frontier. In the town of Ravenna, soldiers of the 13th Legion huddled around campfires, their breath misting in the cold. They sharpened blades and mended cloaks, but all eyes turned toward one man. Gaius Julius Caesar, the conqueror of Gaul, had summoned them for orders that could change the world. The Senate had spoken. Led by Pompey the Great, decrees demanded that Caesar disband his forces and return to Rome as a private citizen. If he refused, he would be branded an enemy of the state. To many senators, the matter was simple. No man could be allowed to command an army at the Republic's gates. But for Caesar, submission meant humiliation, perhaps exile or worse. He knew indictments were ready, charges waiting to strip him of honor. The moment he crossed into Italy without soldiers at his back, he spent days in private debate, pacing the streets of Ravenna by lamplight. Companions urged caution, others whispered of glory. He knew the decision carried no middle ground. To obey was to end his career in disgrace. To resist was to plunge Rome into civil war. His friends watched him wrestle with destiny, aware that hesitation itself could prove fatal. News came swiftly that the Senate had gone further. Consuls proclaimed emergency measures. Pompey was granted authority to defend the Republic with arms. This was no negotiation. The decree left Caesar with a single choice: surrender or defiance. That night, he gathered his officers. "If I cross the frontier with you," he said, "all hope of peace is lost. If I stay, I am destroyed. What path remains?" Silence lingered, broken only when veterans swore they would follow him wherever he led. The frontier lay at the Rubicon, a narrow stream winding through fields under winter frost. By law, no general could lead troops across it into Italy. To do so was to declare war on the state. On that night in January 49 BC, Caesar rode to the river's edge. The water glistened in the moonlight, shallow yet impenetrable as fate itself. His horse halted, and he stared across as though into an abyss. Behind him, the 13th Legion waited in tense silence. Legend records his words. The die is cast. Whether spoken in Latin, Greek, or recalled later by admirers, the phrase carried the weight of finality. He urged his horse forward, splashing through the current. Standards followed, then ranks of soldiers, their boots breaking the icy surface. The Rubicon was crossed. The Republic had entered civil war. Panic erupted in Rome. Messengers raced ahead of the marching legions, spreading word that Caesar was coming. Senators packed wagons with treasure, scrolls, and family heirlooms. The city filled with cries of alarm. Many fled south to join Pompey, who quickly grasped the danger. He knew he could not face Caesar's veterans with untrained recruits. Rather than risk battle in Italy, he withdrew, leading magistrates and loyal nobles toward Capua and then Brundisium, where ships waited. Caesar advanced like a storm. Town after town surrendered without resistance. His reputation alone opened gates. To many Italians, he was not invader, but hero, the general who had brought treasure from Gaul, who had shown clemency to defeated foes, who promised reform against senatorial arrogance. Communities welcomed him with olive branches. Garrisons deserted Pompey's cause, choosing the side that seemed destined for victory. In days rather than months, Italy lay under his control. Not a pitched battle had been fought. He moved with breathtaking speed, pausing only to reassure citizens that he sought no vengeance. Decrees promised protection for property, safety for those who did not resist. This policy of clemency, whether born of calculation or conviction, weakened Pompey's position. Men saw that surrender brought mercy rather than death, and resistance melted away. Still, the masterstroke lay ahead. Pompey had concentrated his forces at Brundisium, preparing to sail east. Caesar pressed south, hoping to trap him before departure. Siege works sprang up around the harbour. Timber palisades stretched across the landward approaches, and soldiers worked day and night to seal the port. But Pompey still commanded the sea. His fleet dominated the Adriatic, and under cover of night, ships carried his men across the water. When dawn came, Caesar gazed upon an empty shoreline. The enemy had slipped away, leaving Italy behind. Though frustrated, he knew the outcome was remarkable. In a matter of weeks, he had taken the heartland of the Republic without bloodshed. Senators had fled, Pompey had withdrawn, and Italy itself was his. To his soldiers, the conquest seemed effortless, but to their commander, it marked only the beginning. Pompey would not remain idle. In Greece and the East, he could summon fleets from Rhodes, legions from Asia, wealth from kings who owed him favors. The war had begun, but its decisive struggle lay beyond the sea. Back in Rome, citizens emerged cautiously from hiding. Shops reopened, markets filled, and the forum bustled once more. Caesar entered the city not as conqueror demanding tribute, but as magistrate promising stability. He addressed the crowd, declaring that he fought not against the Republic, but against corruption and betrayal. He offered pardon to those who laid down arms, even to senators who had fled. His words struck many as sincere, though skeptics whispered that mercy given today might be withdrawn tomorrow. Meanwhile, his soldiers exulted in their commander's fortune. Veterans boasted that the gods themselves favored him, pointing to the ease of their advance as proof. Campfires blazed with songs of triumph. Yet among officers, there was quiet recognition. Pompey still lived, and his name still commanded respect. The East could provide him with armies far larger than any Caesar could raise from Italy alone. The real contest had not been decided. It had only shifted to a grander stage. For now, Caesar prepared. He secured Italy, reorganized administration, and reassured wavering allies. The treasury in Rome offered resources for campaigns yet to come. He wrote letters promising clemency to those still hesitant, hoping to draw wavering senators back into his orbit. Yet his thoughts turned constantly toward the Adriatic horizon, where Pompey was gathering strength. The Republic had split, and both men knew that only one could return to Rome in triumph. The Rubicon was behind him, but destiny lay ahead. Italy was his. But Gaius Julius Caesar, the conqueror of Gaul, knew the war was far from finished. Pompey the Great had escaped across the Adriatic, leaving senators and loyal nobles to rally in Greece. Yet not all of his strength lay there. In Hispania, legions commanded by seasoned lieutenants Lucius Afranius and Marcus Petreius remained firmly in the Pompeian camp. If left unchecked, they could march east and join their master. To secure the Republic, Caesar had to secure Spain. The decision surprised many. Rome expected him to sail immediately after Pompey, striking at the heart of the opposition. But Caesar understood that to chase the eastern conqueror while leaving armies at his back would be folly. He moved west instead, a bold gamble to neutralize the threat in Spain before facing Pompey directly. His legions marched across the breadth of Italy, their columns winding through Apennine passes and fertile valleys. Veterans who had followed him from Gaul set the pace, hardened to long roads and rough weather. In villages along the way, locals greeted them cautiously at first, then with cheers, as Caesar promised protection and clemency. The speed of the advance stunned friend and foe alike. Within weeks, the army reached the Pyrenees. Spain was not merely another province. Its legions were disciplined, commanded by men of long experience. Afranius had served under Pompey in the east, learning strategy from the master himself. Petreius, equally seasoned, carried the reputation of a stern disciplinarian. Together they held terrain difficult for invaders: rivers, mountains, and fortified towns. If Caesar underestimated them, disaster could follow. The campaign centered on the town of Ilerda, perched above the river Segre. Afranius and Petreius fortified their position, confident that time favored them. Caesar's arrival with his veterans turned the region into a chessboard. The armies maneuvered across bridges, riverbanks, and ridges, each side probing for weakness. Rain swelled the rivers, collapsing bridges and stranding detachments. Supply wagons bogged down in mud, and both sides suffered hunger. Caesar himself, wading into floodwaters to rally men, reminded his soldiers that endurance was their greatest weapon. For weeks, the campaign was less a clash of swords than a contest of patience and engineering. Caesar's legions threw up earthworks, dug trenches, and diverted streams. Gradually, he cut off his opponents from food and communication. Afranius attempted to break free, marching his men across open plains, but Caesar shadowed them relentlessly. Skirmishes erupted, yet no decisive battle came. The veterans of Gaul hemmed the Pompeian troops until despair crept through their camp. Finally, surrounded and short of supplies, Afranius and Petreius had no choice. They sought terms. Many expected Caesar to order slaughter. Civil war often meant no mercy. Instead, he chose clemency. Officers were dismissed, soldiers disarmed, but lives were spared. "Let them go," he declared, "and carry to Pompey the news of our mercy." His decision shocked even his allies. By sparing enemies, he gained something more valuable than captives: the reputation of a leader who fought fellow Romans without hatred. The surrender at Ilerda became a masterstroke. Spain, which had threatened to erupt in resistance, lay quiet. The legions once sworn to Pompey returned to their homes, leaving the proconsul free to focus on the greater struggle. Word of his leniency spread quickly. Some hailed it as magnanimity. Others, especially senators across the sea, called it dangerous theatre. Yet for Caesar's cause, it was priceless. Each spared soldier carried a story back to Pompey's camp, that their enemy did not thirst for Roman blood, but for reconciliation. After the conquest of Hispania, Caesar marched toward Italy, halting at Massilia, the Greek-founded city we call Marseille, which had thrown in with Pompey. Defiance there sparked a siege. Fleets clashed in the harbour, engines battered the walls, and defenders hurled missiles from above. The fight would not end quickly, yet he could not linger. Rome called, and Greece remained in Pompey's grip. Crossing back through the passes of the Alps, Caesar entered Italy once more. He did so not as a fugitive, but as master of the peninsula and victor of Spain. The Senate's decrees, once aimed at destroying him, now looked hollow. Citizens greeted him with cheers, veterans clamored for rewards, and magistrates dared not oppose his authority. He moved swiftly toward Rome itself, where the treasury stood locked, guarded by those who claimed he had no right to touch it. When he entered the city, he sought to calm rather than terrify. To the people he promised stability. To the senators still present, he offered clemency. Yet his words were balanced with decisive action. The treasury's locks were broken, its gold seized to fund campaigns ahead. Grain supplies were secured, and debt relief promised. Then, in a dramatic gesture, Caesar accepted the title of dictator, but only for 11 days. Just long enough to preside over elections and confirm his authority as consul once again. By resigning quickly, he signaled that dictatorship would not become his permanent mask. At least not yet. The stage was set for the confrontation all had awaited. Pompey remained across the sea, gathering fleets from Rhodes and Crete, legions from Asia, and gold from Eastern kings. He stood as champion of the Republic, backed by senators and nobles who claimed to defend liberty. Caesar now controlled Italy and Spain, commanded hardened veterans, and carried the momentum of astonishing victories. Both men prepared for a clash that would determine Rome's future. When Caesar returned from Spain, his power stretched from the Alps to the Pyrenees. Yet one city still defied him. Massilia, modern Marseille, stood proudly on the Mediterranean coast, a wealthy Greek colony with centuries of independence. Its people, claiming neutrality, had thrown their support behind Pompey the Great, opening their harbours to his fleet and refusing Caesar's authority. For the conqueror of Gaul, this defiance could not be ignored. He marched south and found the city's walls bristling with defenders. Ships crowded the harbour, supplied by Pompeian allies. To storm Massilia outright would mean heavy losses, and time pressed him to return to Rome. So he entrusted the siege to two of his lieutenants, Decimus Brutus and Gaius Trebonius, while he himself moved northward to secure Italy and prepare for the greater war. The siege that followed became a contest of ingenuity. Roman engineers constructed towering siege machines, rams, towers, and covered galleries that crawled toward the walls under barrages of stones and flaming arrows. The Massilians answered with their own devices, catapults that hurled rocks the size of millstones, pots of pitch set alight, and grappling hooks to drag siege works into ruin. Naval battles erupted in the harbour as Caesar's hastily assembled fleet clashed with experienced sailors from Pompey's camp. Decimus Brutus, though young, proved daring. His ships rammed enemy triremes, boarding parties fought hand to hand, and gradually Roman control of the sea tightened. Inside the city, famine and fear spread. Citizens debated whether loyalty to Pompey was worth starvation. Some urged surrender, others defiance. The siege dragged on, months passing, while the broader war raced ahead. At last, with supplies exhausted and hope gone, the city yielded. Caesar's clemency again surprised many. Instead of sack and slaughter, he spared the inhabitants, though garrisons were placed to ensure obedience. Massilia had defied him, but it would live, its independence gone, its fate tied now to Rome's new master. While his lieutenants hammered at Massilia's walls, Caesar strode back into the capital. His return was measured, not triumphant. He entered not with legions drawn up in battle array, but with the calm assurance of authority. The treasury, sealed against him by order of the Senate, was broken open. Gold and silver poured forth to fund the campaigns to come. He justified the act by declaring that Rome's defense required it, and few dared object. The people greeted him with cheers, for he promised stability in a city exhausted by chaos. Debts were adjusted, grain supplies secured, and order restored. Senators who had not fled received him warily, but he extended offers of pardon. Many distrusted his words, yet some accepted, calculating that resistance was futile. His message was clear. He sought not vengeance, but unity, though unity under his command. In a calculated gesture, Caesar accepted the title of dictator. But unlike Sulla, who had wielded the office for years, he held it only long enough to organize elections. Within weeks, he resigned, having secured the consulship for himself and loyal colleagues. The move disarmed critics. By discarding supreme power almost as soon as he received it, he appeared to act not as tyrant, but as statesman. Yet the symbolism was unmistakable. The Republic's highest offices now bent to his will. With authority consolidated, he turned his gaze eastward. Pompey had escaped, gathering forces in Greece. Fleets from Rhodes, Crete, and Egypt carried his banners. Kings sent gold and men, eager to prove loyalty to the man the Senate hailed as defender of liberty. By contrast, Caesar commanded veterans hardened by a decade of war, but lacked ships to cross in pursuit. The coming struggle would not be decided quickly, and before confronting his rival, he needed to secure every corner of Italy and the western provinces. In the Forum, citizens debated openly. Some claimed Caesar's clemency showed he sought reconciliation, not domination. Others warned that his mercy was only mask, that once Pompey was crushed, the Republic would follow. Meanwhile, his soldiers cared little for politics. They had marched with him through Gaul, faced hunger at Alesia, and now watched as their commander held Rome itself. To them, his authority was natural, his destiny unquestioned. The Senate, diminished and scattered, offered little resistance. Those who had followed Pompey cursed Caesar as traitor. Those who remained in the city swore loyalty, hoping to preserve influence under his rule. Magistrates carried out his decrees, and for the first time in months, life in Rome seemed stable. Markets reopened, theatres filled, and farmers returned to their fields. The shadow of civil war lingered, but for ordinary citizens, the presence of one strong leader brought a measure of calm. Still, beneath the surface, preparations for the next act of war gathered pace. Caesar ordered shipyards along the Italian coast to build fleets. Messengers sped across provinces, summoning reinforcements. Officers drilled recruits in fields outside the city. In taverns and households, whispers spread of the coming confrontation. Everyone knew the storm would break, not in Italy, but in Greece, where Pompey gathered his host. As winter approached, news arrived from Massilia. The city had finally surrendered. Its defiance ended. The way west was secure. Caesar praised his lieutenants for their success and turned his attention fully to the east. He had taken Italy without bloodshed, subdued Spain through strategy, pacified a rebellious city, and held the consulship once more. Step by step, he had tightened his grip on power. But the decisive contest still waited across the Adriatic, where Pompey the Great stood at the head of senators, nobles, and allied kings. For now, Rome rested uneasily. Citizens enjoyed a fragile peace. Markets thrived again, and magistrates pretended the Republic remained intact. But everyone knew the truth. Caesar and Pompey had yet to face one another. The duels in Spain, the siege at Massilia, the seizure of the treasury, these were preludes. The real war was gathering far away, and when it came, it would decide not just who ruled, but what Rome itself would become. Pompey the Great stood on the deck of a Rhodian trireme as it cut through the winter seas. Behind him stretched a convoy of ships carrying senators, magistrates, and noble families who had fled Rome in haste. He had chosen not to defend Italy against the advance of his rival. Instead, he withdrew across the Adriatic, confident that the East, long a source of his triumphs, would supply the men and resources to restore his fortunes. The gamble was shrewd. In Greece and Asia Minor, Pompey's name still commanded reverence. He had cleared the seas of pirates, humbled Mithridates, and reorganized kingdoms into obedient provinces. Kings remembered his favor. Cities recalled the prosperity he had brought. When word spread that he was gathering forces, allies responded with enthusiasm. Fleets came from Rhodes and Crete, ships from Achaia and Macedonia. Envoys from Egypt promised grain, while eastern princes offered tribute. In camp, the scene resembled both a military muster and a senatorial session. Cato, Metellus Scipio, Cicero, and dozens of others crowded Pompey's headquarters, their purple-bordered togas, a reminder that this was more than a general's camp. It was the Republic in exile. They hailed him as the defender of liberty, the man chosen to preserve Rome from tyranny. With their voices behind him, Pompey's authority carried legitimacy Caesar could not match. The mustering of troops began immediately. In Epirus, Thessaly, and Macedonia, raw recruits gathered under veteran officers. Camps rose swiftly, their ditches deep and palisades sturdy. Daily drills hardened the inexperienced. Marches under full load, spear practice until arms ached, mock battles that raised clouds of dust over the plains. The sound of trumpets echoed through valleys once quiet, and farmers watched as their fields filled with soldiers learning the Roman art of war. The contrast between the armies could not have been sharper. Across the Adriatic, the conqueror of Gaul commanded veterans who had followed him for 10 years, through rain-soaked forests and desperate sieges. Their discipline needed no rehearsal. Pompey, however, possessed something his rival lacked: command of the sea. With fleets at his disposal, he controlled the Adriatic, blocking crossings and ensuring supplies flowed freely to his own camps. Naval supremacy meant that he could choose the time and place of battle, while Caesar's men, however skilled, remained stranded unless ships could be built or captured. Pompey took no chances. Though praised as daring in his youth, he now showed the caution of experience. He ordered fortifications at every harbour, stationed ships along key routes, and placed guards on mountain passes. His allies grumbled that he moved too slowly, but he understood that patience was his greatest ally. Every month that passed increased his numbers, while time eroded Caesar's resources. The Senate in exile played its part as well. Orators thundered that they fought not for Pompey, but for the Republic itself. Decrees were issued, officers appointed, and taxes levied on allied states. To the recruits, the presence of senators lent solemnity to their cause. They believed they fought for the survival of Rome's traditions, not simply the ambition of one man. Whether that belief endured in battle was another matter, but it gave purpose to the long months of preparation. By spring, the army in Greece had swollen to immense proportions. Some sources claimed 40,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry, though numbers varied. What mattered was the sense of scale. Fields that once held sheep now bristled with tents. Foreign contingents marched under their own standards, mingling with Roman cohorts. Princes from the east rode proudly at Pompey's side, eager to show loyalty. At reviews, the lines stretched further than the eye could follow, and senators nodded in satisfaction. Surely such a force could not be defeated. Yet not all were convinced. Veterans who remembered the discipline of Caesar's legions whispered that numbers alone could not win battles. They pointed to Spain, where Afranius and Petreius had surrendered despite advantage, and to Massilia, which had fallen after months of siege. Pompey listened but dismissed their concerns. He believed that his superior cavalry, drawn from noble houses and allied kings, would overwhelm Caesar's foot soldiers when the clash finally came. Meanwhile in Italy, Caesar moved with restless energy. Shipyards along the coast rang with hammers as carpenters built fleets from raw timber. Recruits drilled under centurions, and dispatches urged allies to remain loyal. Yet for all his efforts, he could not disguise his disadvantage at sea. Each attempt to cross the Adriatic faced the wall of Pompey's navy. Frustration grew among his men, though their devotion never wavered. They trusted that their commander would find a way. Reports of Pompey's strength trickled back to Rome, carried by merchants and envoys. Citizens whispered of vast camps across the sea, of senators scheming for his victory, of kings pouring treasure into his coffers. Some took heart that resistance endured, while others feared the war would soon consume them. Markets reopened under Caesar's order, but taverns buzzed with guesses about when and where the giants would clash. In Pompey's camp, the atmosphere mingled confidence with unease. Senators debated endlessly, urging immediate battle or counseling delay. Younger officers, eager for glory, begged to be unleashed. Older men remembered the slaughter of civil wars past and advised patience. Pompey walked among them, outwardly calm, his cloak wrapped tight against the evening chill. He knew his decision would decide the Republic's fate. As summer approached, he reviewed his legions on the plains of Thessaly. Trumpets sounded, standards dipped, and thousands of soldiers marched in precise formation. Senators cheered, convinced that victory was inevitable. Pompey raised his hand, acknowledging their acclaim, yet his mind weighed the dangers. His rival commanded fewer troops, but ones hardened by years of struggle. Discipline and loyalty, not numbers, might determine the outcome. Still, he believed fortune favored him. He had fleets, allies, resources, and legitimacy. His rival had daring and veterans, but dared not cross openly while the Adriatic remained closed. Time, Pompey told himself, was on his side. Winter seas crashed against the coast, as Caesar, the conqueror of Gaul, prepared the boldest gamble of his life. Pompey the Great had gathered fleets enough to block the Adriatic, yet the proconsul resolved to cross with his veterans before the blockade closed completely. In early January, under a moonless sky, ships slipped out from Brundisium. Oars cut silently through the waves, sails sagged in weak winds, and by dawn the first transports had reached Epirus. Against all odds, thousands of legionaries set foot on Greek soil. The landing was perilous. Caesar possessed courage in abundance, but not ships. His fleet was too small to carry the entire army at once. Half his forces, including precious cavalry, remained behind in Italy. Still, he advanced inland with what men he had, hoping to secure supplies and establish a foothold. Villages surrendered quickly, their inhabitants bewildered at the sudden arrival of soldiers from across the sea. Yet the danger was clear. Without reinforcements, he risked being trapped between the Adriatic and Pompey's approaching host. In the weeks that followed, fortune turned sharply. Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, commanding Pompey's fleet, tightened the blockade. Reinforcements under Mark Antony attempted to cross but faced storms and enemy triremes. Some ships sank. others were captured. Only a portion of Caesar's cavalry reached him, and even then, at great cost. Bibulus, determined to starve the invader, camped aboard ship, refusing to set foot on land. His men suffered from cold and hunger, but kept their vigil. By spring, Caesar realized that the bulk of his army was cut off, yet audacity carried him forward. He marched into Epirus, establishing camps along the Thapsus River. Pompey advanced cautiously, his larger force shadowing the invader. For months, the armies maneuvered across valleys and ridges, each probing the other, neither willing to risk decisive battle. Skirmishes erupted over foraging parties, but the clash both sides expected never came. Caesar, short of cavalry and supplies, avoided open ground. Pompey, commanding superior numbers, hesitated to attack fortified veterans. The campaign became a test of nerves. At last, the two giants confronted one another near the city of Dyrrhachium, a coastal stronghold that controlled vital supply routes. Pompey seized the port, securing grain and access to the sea. Caesar, unwilling to yield, devised an audacious plan. He would encircle his enemy. With astonishing speed, his legions began building earthworks stretching for miles, a chain of walls and ditches intended to pen Pompey against the shore. Observers marveled that soldiers who had marched for years could still labor with such energy. Timber was felled, towers erected, trenches dug. Slowly the cordon tightened. The maneuver astonished the world. That one general would dare to besiege another, when both commanded entire armies, seemed madness. Yet Caesar's veterans believed nothing impossible. They drove stakes into frozen soil, hauled stones for ramparts, and endured hunger as rations dwindled. For a time, Pompey himself seemed uncertain. His men, confined between the sea and enemy works, grew restless. Rumors spread that famine would force surrender. Senators in his camp muttered anxiously, fearing that the master of the Republic might be undone by engineering rather than battle. But fortune shifted again. Cavalry from allied kings swelled Pompey's ranks, letting him hammer weak points in the enemy's lines. Skirmishes grew into pitched battles, one nearly capturing an entire cohort before Caesar rallied the defense. Hunger wore down his men, supplies scarce in the barren hills. The besieger now risked becoming the besieged. The crisis came in midsummer. Pompey launched a full assault on a vulnerable sector of the works near the sea. Towers fell, trenches were flooded, and cohorts were cut down as they struggled to hold. Caesar ordered counterattacks, but the weight of numbers overwhelmed his defense. Thousands fell, prisoners were taken, and panic spread through the camps. For the first time in the war, Caesar's veterans tasted serious defeat. He ordered a withdrawal inland, abandoning the great lines that had astonished the world. The retreat was disciplined, but morale wavered. Around campfires, soldiers muttered that fortune had turned. Supplies were scarce, and the enemy now marched in triumph. Yet Caesar refused despair. Addressing his men, he reminded them of past hardships. At Alesia, we starved, but endured. In Spain, we forced surrender without battle. The Republic cannot be saved by fortune alone. It must be saved by courage. His words rekindled devotion. Even in setback, his charisma bound the army together. Pompey's victory at Dyrrhachium could have been decisive. His officers urged immediate pursuit, certain that a fleeing enemy could be destroyed. But caution restrained him. Perhaps remembering disasters of rash commanders, he chose not to press too hard. Caesar's legions retreated in good order, regrouping beyond Thessaly. The respite proved crucial. Had Pompey struck harder, the war might have ended in Greece that summer. For now, both sides paused. Caesar licked his wounds, gathering reinforcements and foraging for supplies. Pompey enjoyed the prestige of victory, but struggled with the arrogance of senators who pressed him to finish the war. Each knew the struggle was not over. Dyrrhachium had shown that even Caesar could be beaten, yet it also revealed Pompey's hesitancy to exploit success. As autumn approached, both armies turned their eyes inland. Thessaly, rich in grain and open plains, beckoned. There, far from the coasts and fleets, the final reckoning would come. For now, the fields around Dyrrhachium lay scarred with trenches and ramparts, mute witnesses to a campaign of audacity, endurance, and missed opportunity. The fortifications at Dyrrhachium lay silent now, their trenches filled with weeds, their timber works collapsing into the soil. For months, Caesar, the conqueror of Gaul, had tried to pen in Pompey the Great along the Adriatic coast. Instead, he had been forced to abandon the effort after a costly reverse. His veterans, long unaccustomed to defeat, marched inland with grim faces, yet their retreat did not break them. Hardened by a decade of campaigns, they placed their trust in the commander who had led them from the forests of Gaul to the gates of Rome. The road east carried them into Thessaly. Here the landscape changed. Fertile plains spread wide, watered by rivers and dotted with villages. The soil was rich, the climate gentle, and for the first time in weeks, the men could eat more than meager rations. Farmers watched from a distance as cohorts tramped through their fields, shields glinting in the sun. Grain was seized, mills turned day and night, and the hungry legionaries regained their strength. The memory of Dyrrhachium still haunted the camp, but bellies full of bread steadied nerves as surely as speeches. Pompey followed with deliberate caution. In his camp, senators and nobles exulted in the recent victory and pressed for a final blow. "Strike while the usurper reels," they urged. Young aristocrats, eager for renown, mocked their commander's restraint. They claimed that Caesar's men were already broken, that one sharp battle would end the war. Pompey listened, but did not bend. He had seen too much of war to underestimate an enemy who had marched undefeated for so long. His strategy remained simple: avoid rashness, cut off supplies, and let hunger destroy the intruder. Weeks stretched into months. Across Thessaly, the two armies shadowed one another, moving from river to river, plain to plain. Skirmishes erupted over foraging parties. Smoke rose from burning farms. Villagers fled to the hills as their fields were stripped bare. Neither side wished to risk a full engagement, yet neither could disengage. Caesar's men endured long marches, often to find their enemy encamped on the next ridge. Pompey's troops, flush with numbers, grew impatient at endless maneuvers. In Caesar's camp, anxiety festered. Supplies dwindled as the countryside was scoured. Men recalled the hunger of Alesia, when they had held out against a host of Gauls. Once again, survival depended on endurance. Their commander walked among them each evening, speaking not as distant master, but as comrade. He ate their bread, shared their tents, and reminded them of victories snatched from hardship. "We have known worse," he told them. "This war will end, not in hunger, but in triumph." His confidence steadied them, though doubt lingered. Meanwhile, in Pompey's headquarters, the Senate in exile grew restless. Cato thundered that delay dishonored Rome. Cicero wrote of weariness at endless councils. Noble youths clamored for battle, boasting that Caesar's army would scatter at first charge. Pompey weighed their words against his own judgment. To wait meant safety, but it also risked losing the momentum won at Dyrrhachium. Senators muttered that caution masked weakness. At last, pressed from all sides, he resolved to give battle. The chosen ground lay near the town of Pharsalus. Wide, level plains stretched beneath the summer sun, perfect for deploying cavalry, the arm in which Pompey held overwhelming superiority. Rivers provided water, fields offered space for camps, and roads led easily to supply lines. Confident, he marched his men there and raised fortifications. Standards rose above new ditches, trumpets sounded, and the plain became an arena where destiny would be tested. Caesar advanced with determination. To retreat further would sap morale and embolden the Senate's champions. His soldiers, though fewer, longed for a chance to wipe away the shame of Dyrrhachium. They marched into Thessaly with banners high, their battered shields shining from fresh polish. At Pharsalus, they established camp opposite their enemy, close enough to hear trumpet calls and taunts drifting across the plain. For several days, the two armies stared at one another, lines drawn but motionless, like gladiators awaiting the signal to strike. The contrast was stark. Pompey commanded nearly double the infantry and far more cavalry, bolstered by allied contingents from kings and princes. Senators moved among the ranks, promising swift triumph and glory. Caesar's force was smaller, his cavalry dangerously thin, yet his legions were veterans of Gaul, men who had endured winters in the forests and sieges against impossible odds. Their confidence came not from numbers, but from 10 years of shared struggle under a leader who had never abandoned them. On the eve of battle, both generals addressed their troops. Pompey promised certain victory. He assured his soldiers that his horsemen would sweep the field and crush the enemy flank. He pointed to the senators watching from camp, declaring that all of Rome's honor rested on their arms. Across the plain, Caesar spoke in measured tones. "Before us," he said, "stand men who call themselves defenders of the Republic. Behind us lies only hunger and exile. One battle decides everything. Let us show them the courage that has carried us from Gaul to here." His words were not elaborate, but his men felt their weight. They had no retreat, no second chance, only victory or ruin. That night, campfires dotted the plain like fallen constellations. Songs rose from the tents, prayers were murmured, and weapons polished for the morning. Veterans remembered past campaigns. Recruits trembled at the unknown. Some wrote hurried letters, others sharpened blades until sparks flew. The air itself seemed taut, heavy with anticipation. Dawn came, clear and hot. Trumpets blared, standards lifted, and legions moved into position. Dust billowed as ranks formed, shields locked, and cavalry mounted. On one side stood Pompey the Great, champion of the Senate, master of fleets and allies from across the east. On the other stood Caesar, the conqueror of Gaul, leading veterans hardened beyond imagining. Between them stretched the plain of Pharsalus, soon to be seared into history as the ground where the Republic's fate would be decided. Morning mist clung to the fields of Thessaly as two armies formed for battle. Across the plain of Pharsalus, thousands of shields caught the rising sun, a blaze of bronze and iron stretching from riverbank to hillside. The moment Rome had dreaded for years had come. Pompey the Great stood with the Senate at his back, commanding the larger force. Opposite him, Caesar, the conqueror of Gaul, arranged a smaller but hardened host that had marched with him from the forests of the north to the gates of Greece. The disparity was plain to see. Pompey's infantry nearly doubled his opponents, and his cavalry outnumbered them several times over. Allied kings and princes swelled his ranks with horsemen renowned for their speed. Standards waved above a mass of men, confident that sheer numbers would crush a worn enemy. Senators, robed in purple-bordered togas, moved among the ranks, assuring the soldiers that victory meant not only triumph, but the salvation of the Republic. Caesar's army was thinner, his cavalry a fraction of the enemy's, yet discipline bound them together. Each cohort had endured years of relentless campaigning. They had fought Germans in thick forests, Gauls in fortified hilltops, and Britons across stormy seas. The soldiers lined up with quiet determination, shields battered but firm, their faith resting on the commander who had never failed them. Pompey drew up his forces with confidence. He placed legions in deep ranks across the center, posted archers and slingers in front, and massed his formidable cavalry on the left wing. There he stationed the flower of his army, noble youths and eastern allies, ready to sweep the field. The plan was clear: overwhelm Caesar's small cavalry, then wheel into the flank and rear of the infantry, crushing them in a single decisive charge. On the opposite line, Caesar recognized the danger. His own horsemen, few and weary, could not withstand such numbers. To meet the threat, he devised an unorthodox measure. Behind his cavalry, he placed a hidden reserve of infantry, drawn from veterans known for their steadiness. These cohorts, formed in tight ranks, were ordered to hold their spears like pikes, ready to meet the enemy horse face to face. The maneuver was risky, but offered the only chance of neutralizing Pompey's advantage. As the sun rose higher, drums thundered and trumpets blared. The armies advanced, the ground trembling under the weight of thousands of boots. Dust rose in clouds as Pompey's horsemen charged, lances leveled, banners streaming. Caesar's small cavalry met them briefly, then, as expected, began to give way. Shouts of triumph rang from Pompey's lines as the mass of riders surged forward, certain of victory. But as they pressed in, the hidden infantry reserve stepped out. Cohorts advanced in grim silence, shields locked, spears thrust at horse and rider alike. The sudden wall of points startled the cavalry. Horses reared, riders tumbled, formations faltered. The momentum of the charge dissolved in confusion. Veterans lunged upward, stabbing faces and throats, cutting down men unused to fighting at such close quarters. Panic spread through the horsemen. What had begun as a triumphant sweep turned into a rout. The cavalry scattered, pursued by Caesar's reorganized horse. With the left wing collapsing, the battle shifted. Caesar's cavalry, once on the verge of flight, now wheeled against the flank of Pompey's infantry. Veterans pressed forward in steady ranks, their lines rolling like an iron tide. Trumpets signaled the advance, and legion after legion surged into combat. The clash was immense. Shields slammed, swords rang, men grappled in the dust. Arrows darkened the sky, and the roar of battle echoed across the plain. Pompey's infantry resisted bravely. For hours the two armies struggled, neither yielding easily. But discipline and momentum told. Caesar's men pressed harder, their cohesion unbroken, while their opponents wavered under pressure. The collapse of the cavalry left their flank exposed, and attacks poured in from multiple sides. Gradually, the great line began to buckle. At last, the strain proved too much. One cohort broke, then another. Panic surged through Pompey's army. Soldiers dropped shields and fled toward the camp, trampling comrades in desperation. What had begun as a contest of equals became a rout. Veterans of Caesar's host, relentless and disciplined, cut down fugitives and stormed the fortifications. The enemy camp, once bristling with standards, erupted in chaos as men scrambled for safety. Pompey himself watched in disbelief. The plan he had trusted collapsed before his eyes. The cavalry he had relied upon had not merely failed, they had vanished. Senators who had urged battle now fled in terror, their fine cloaks trampled in the dust. Seeing the collapse, Pompey abandoned the field, slipping away with a handful of attendants. The man once hailed as Rome's greatest commander rode from Pharsalus without giving a single order to rally his men. By afternoon, the plain was a scene of devastation. Thousands lay dead, their armor gleaming dully beneath the sun. Streams of blood mingled with trampled wheat. Caesar walked among the fallen, his face grave. Victory was his, but it had come at a terrible cost. Even hardened veterans had fallen in droves. Yet the outcome was decisive. The Senate's cause lay in ruins, and Pompey's flight marked the end of their great hope. Prisoners were gathered, among them senators, magistrates, and noble youths who had boasted of victory that very morning. Many expected harsh retribution. Instead, Caesar chose clemency. Officers were spared, rank and file dismissed. He understood that mercy could achieve what slaughter could not. It could bind former enemies to his side and show that the war was not for vengeance but for mastery of Rome. As night fell, the battlefield lay quiet. Fires burned across the captured camp, where soldiers feasted on enemy stores. In the distance, wolves prowled among the dead. Caesar withdrew to his tent, aware that the war was not finished. Pompey had escaped, and the East still offered refuge. Yet the decisive clash had been fought, and its outcome was clear. Pharsalus had given him mastery of the Republic's fate. The dust of Pharsalus still stained Pompey the Great when he rode from the field. Just hours earlier, he had presided over Rome's grandest force, senators close at hand and standards bright beneath the Thessalian sky. Now he fled with only a handful of attendants, his cloak torn, his mind stunned by the swiftness of collapse. The man once hailed as Rome's guardian left the battlefield without command, without plan, without even words of farewell to those who had trusted him. Through the night, he rode south. Villages shuttered their doors as the small party passed. Farmers who once cheered his name watched in silence. At the coast, he found ships waiting, remnants of his once mighty fleet. With them, he sailed to Mytilene on the island of Lesbos, where his wife Cornelia had awaited news of victory. Instead, she received him in defeat. Ancient writers recalled her tears at the sight of the man she had married, aged, weary, stripped of confidence. Still, she stood by him, urging courage, and together they planned their next move. The East still offered hope. Pompey's name carried weight in Syria, Cilicia, and Egypt. Kings remembered his favor. Cities still honored his past victories. He considered seeking refuge in Syria, where loyal governors might provide troops. Others advised Africa, where Cato and Metellus Scipio still commanded Pompeian remnants. Yet distance and uncertainty weighed heavily. Egypt lay closer, rich and powerful, a kingdom tied to Rome by alliances and debts. There he hoped he might rebuild his fortunes. The voyage south carried him across familiar waters. Only a decade earlier, he had reorganized these provinces, humbled Mithridates, and placed the young Ptolemy dynasty under Rome's protection. Now, ironically, he sailed to that same dynasty for aid. Beside him, Cornelia looked out across the sea, silent but resolute. Their few companions whispered of fortune's cruelty, that the man once master of the Mediterranean now clung to exile and foreign favor. Egypt itself was no stranger to turmoil. On the Nile's throne sat Ptolemy XIII, a boy barely into adolescence, guided by ambitious courtiers and regents. His elder sister Cleopatra, once co-ruler, had been driven into exile. The court seethed with intrigue, factions jostling for dominance. To them, Pompey's sudden arrival posed a dilemma: aid him and risk the wrath of Caesar, whose legions had triumphed at Pharsalus. Reject him and risk losing the goodwill of Roman senators who still resisted. Councils met in haste at Pelusium, the great port of the eastern delta. advisors weighed their options. Some argued that to welcome Pompey would be to stand with tradition, with the Republic's Senate, and perhaps secure his protection in return. Others warned that Caesar, flushed with victory, would soon arrive and punish any who harbored his rival. The regents resolved on a grim solution. They would eliminate Pompey and present his death as a gift to Caesar. In their eyes, betrayal promised safety. As Pompey's small fleet anchored off the Egyptian coast, he saw soldiers gathering on the shore. Among them were men he had once commanded years before, now serving as mercenaries for the Ptolemaic court. From a distance, it seemed welcome. Boats were launched to ferry him ashore. The veteran commander, weary and trusting, prepared to disembark. Cornelia, sensing danger, begged him to remain aboard, but pride and hope guided his choice. In foreign lands, he insisted, a man must trust others. With that, he stepped into the skiff that would carry him to his fate. The boat pushed through shallow waters, Egyptian soldiers rowing silently. Pompey sat cloaked, his expression grave. Beside him, an old veteran named Septimius, once his subordinate in campaigns past, looked on without warmth. As the skiff reached shore, Pompey rose to greet the men awaiting him. In that moment, Septimius drew his dagger and struck. Blades followed. The conqueror of the east fell upon the sand, blood mingling with the Nile's tide. Without ceremony, his body was left where it lay, his severed head taken as proof. From the ship, Cornelia watched in horror. She saw her husband cut down before her eyes, powerless to intervene. The sailors turned their vessel back to sea, carrying her away in grief and despair. Thus ended the life of the man once hailed as Rome's greatest general, betrayed not by enemies in battle, but by supposed allies seeking favor. When Caesar reached Egypt weeks later, the Ptolemaic court presented him with the grisly trophy. Advisors expected gratitude. Instead, he recoiled. Ancient writers recorded that he turned his face away, weeping at the sight of his rival's head. For all their conflict, Pompey had once been his ally, his son-in-law, his partner in rule. To see him murdered, unarmed and abandoned, struck a chord deeper than triumph. To Caesar, it was not victory, but tragedy. The news reverberated through the Mediterranean. Senators still at large mourned or cursed, depending on their loyalties. To some, Pompey's death meant the end of the Republic's last defender. To others, it removed a rival who might have prolonged civil war. In Rome itself, citizens received the tidings with awe. The man who had cleared the seas of pirates, reorganized the East, and filled the treasury with spoils had died on a foreign shore, not in the forum or on the battlefield, but cut down like a fugitive. For Caesar, the death of Pompey solved one problem but opened another. Instead of securing peace, it drew him into Egypt's tangled politics. The regents expected gratitude for their deed, but they had miscalculated. Caesar mourned the fallen general, then turned his gaze upon the divided kingdom that had dared to spill Roman blood on its own soil. Cleopatra sought his favor. Her brother's advisors sought his support, and soon Egypt itself would become the stage for further war. But at Pelusium, the sand held the final chapter of Pompey's long career. Born to privilege, he had risen to command legions before his beard had grown. He had celebrated triumphs in 3 continents, humbled kings, and stood as Rome's greatest general before Caesar's star rose. His name had been spoken in awe from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. And yet, in the end, he died on a lonely shore, abandoned by fortune, his fate decided by frightened courtiers who sought advantage in betrayal. The man who once believed he carried the Republic's destiny had fallen, and with him vanished the last hope of those who thought Pompey's victory could preserve tradition. Rome's fate now rested entirely in the hands of Caesar, the conqueror of Gaul, who wept for the rival he had defeated but not destroyed. The death of Pompey the Great had left Egypt's rulers confident they had secured Caesar's gratitude. Courtiers believed they had removed his rival and presented a gift that would earn them Rome's favor. But when the conqueror of Gaul arrived in Alexandria and was shown the severed head of the man who had once been his ally, son-in-law, and greatest rival, he turned away in visible grief. Tears, witnesses said, filled his eyes. Mercy or cruelty on the battlefield was his choice, but treachery repelled him. The gesture meant not security for Egypt, but the beginning of Roman entanglement in its dynastic quarrels. Alexandria itself was a wonder. Marble palaces gleamed along the shoreline. Colonnades stretched toward the harbour, and the great Pharos lighthouse blazed its beam across the Mediterranean. The city held libraries, temples, and a cosmopolitan population of Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, and merchants from every land. Yet beneath the grandeur lay bitter division. On one throne sat Ptolemy the 13th, a boy manipulated by regents and generals. His sister, Cleopatra, once co-ruler, had been cast aside, forced into exile in the deserts of Syria. The siblings' quarrel had already torn Egypt apart before Caesar ever stepped ashore. The general entered the palace as arbiter, declaring that he would mediate between the feuding monarchs. To the regents, this was unwelcome news. They had hoped to present a united front, secured by Pompey's murder. Instead, they found Rome's strongest man demanding settlement on his terms. Soldiers loyal to the boy king glared at Caesar's veterans, who strode confidently through the halls. Tensions simmered, and whispers of assassination filled the corridors. Into this fraught scene came Cleopatra. Legend paints her arrival in theatrical strokes, smuggled past guards in a rug or linen sack, carried secretly into Caesar's chambers. Whether true or embroidered, the story captured the audacity of a young queen who refused to surrender her claim. When she emerged before the Roman commander, she captivated him. Her wit, intelligence, and presence impressed as much as her beauty. Caesar, weary from war and betrayal, found in her a partner whose ambition matched his own. Their alliance was sealed quickly, political necessity entwined with personal attraction. This union outraged the regents. To them, Caesar had chosen sides, elevating Cleopatra against the boy they served. Riots broke out in Alexandria, streets filled with armed men, stones hurled at Roman patrols, shouts echoing against temple walls. The city became a battlefield, its marble avenues stained with blood. Ptolemy's forces, numbering tens of thousands, besieged the palace quarter where Caesar and Cleopatra held their ground. The conqueror of Gaul, though far from home, faced yet another war. The conflict became known as the Alexandrian War. It was no grand clash of legions, but a desperate struggle fought street by street. Roman cohorts fortified the palace and nearby theatre, hurling missiles from rooftops, pushing back assaults at narrow gates. Fires consumed whole districts, smoke blotting out the sun. Civilians fled in terror, while rival factions turned temples into strongholds. Caesar, outnumbered, relied on discipline and ingenuity. He ordered canals cut to bring water, built siege engines from whatever timber could be found, and fought alongside his men in the press of combat. One disaster nearly ended it all. Egyptian ships in the harbour threatened to cut off supply. To deny them, Caesar ordered the fleet burned. Flames spread uncontrollably, consuming warehouses and docks. Ancient accounts claimed the fire reached the fabled library, destroying thousands of scrolls. Whether true or exaggerated, the blaze became legend. Alexandria, jewel of the Mediterranean, now bore scars of Caesar's struggle for survival. Reinforcements arrived slowly. From Syria, allies dispatched troops who forced their way into the city to join the Romans. With their help, the tide turned. Battles raged along canals and causeways. Ptolemy's soldiers fought with courage, pressing the Romans hard, but discipline and tactics prevailed. In one climactic engagement on the Nile Delta, the boy king's forces were routed. Amid the chaos, Ptolemy himself attempted to flee by boat. Overloaded, the vessel capsized, and the young monarch drowned, swallowed by the river that had sustained Egypt since antiquity. With his death, resistance crumbled. Cleopatra was restored to the throne, now ruling beside a younger brother as custom demanded, though in truth her power rested on Roman arms. To Caesar, victory brought more than political settlement. The queen soon bore him a child, Ptolemy Caesar, remembered to history as Caesarion. Rumors spread across the Mediterranean, blending scandal with fascination. Rome's greatest general had allied himself with Egypt's most ambitious queen, forging a bond of bed and bedchamber alike. For several months, Caesar remained in Alexandria, enjoying both the luxuries of the court and the company of Cleopatra. Banquets glittered with gold plate, music drifted through perfumed halls, and processions along the Nile displayed the wealth of a kingdom unlike any province of Rome. Critics later accused him of indulgence, of forgetting duty amid foreign splendor. Supporters countered that he secured grain shipments vital to Rome and ensured Egypt's loyalty. Whatever the truth, the conqueror of Gaul left Alexandria bound to Cleopatra and to a son whose existence would echo in politics long after his death. Still, no respite lasted long. News reached him of threats in the east. Pharsalus, son of the old enemy Mithridates, had seized lands in Pontus, proclaiming himself master of territory Rome claimed. Even as he reveled in triumph beside Cleopatra, Caesar knew he must march again. The civil war was not over, and new challenges awaited. Egypt had been secured, but the world beyond the Nile still burned. The Nile was quiet behind him when Caesar turned east. Months in Alexandria had secured Cleopatra on her throne, but news from Asia Minor could not be ignored. Pharsalus, son of Mithridates, had risen in Pontus. Like his father, he despised Roman rule and saw opportunity in the chaos of civil war. With Caesar locked in Egypt and Pompey's followers still stirring in Africa, Pharsalus struck boldly, overrunning territories Rome claimed as allies. His armies looted towns, enslaved populations, and sent messages across the region, proclaiming that the old kingdom of Pontus had been reborn. The conqueror of Gaul could not allow such defiance. It was not only prestige at stake. If Rome's allies in Asia wavered, the entire eastern frontier might unravel. Trade routes through the Black Sea, grain shipments from the coast, and loyalties painstakingly built during Pompey's eastern campaigns could collapse in weeks. Caesar marched north as soon as Alexandria was secure, leaving detachments to maintain order along the Nile, while he carried the war into Anatolia. The journey was relentless. From Egypt, his columns moved through Syria and Cilicia, across mountain passes where snow lingered on ridges. Local communities provided guides, mules, and grain. Cities opened their gates, more eager to show loyalty to Rome's rising master than risk his displeasure. Even so, the march strained soldiers already worn from years of civil conflict. They trudged on, driven by discipline and the presence of a commander who never spared himself hardship. Pharsalus prepared for confrontation at Zela, a stronghold in the hills of Pontus. He believed terrain and numbers favored him. His troops, though less disciplined than Roman veterans, were fierce and accustomed to the rugged landscape. Many remembered their fathers who had fought alongside Mithridates against earlier Roman invasions. To them, this campaign was not just rebellion, but revenge. Caesar advanced swiftly, refusing to grant the enemy time to consolidate. Camps sprang up near Zela, earthworks dug as if his men had endless strength. Reconnaissance revealed the Pontic army entrenched on high ground, their banners fluttering above ditches and palisades. The position seemed formidable, yet Caesar had faced greater odds in Gaul. He resolved to strike with speed before hesitation sapped morale. The clash unfolded with brutal suddenness. Romans moved at dawn, advancing across uneven ground in close formation. Pontic troops poured down the slopes, hurling javelins and charging with wild cries. For a moment, the veterans staggered under the ferocity, lines bending as men fell. Caesar rode among them, steadying the cohorts, signaling reserves forward. His presence transformed hesitation into resolve. Shields locked, swords thrust, and the Roman advance ground forward step by step. Within hours, the Pontic line fractured. Disorder spread as discipline faltered, and the Romans seized the moment. Cohorts surged uphill, driving the enemy back into their own camp. The palisades that had seemed impregnable now trapped the fugitives, who were cut down in masses. By midday, the field was silent, save for the groans of the dying. Pharsalus fled east with a handful of attendants, his army destroyed in a single day. The speed of the victory astonished all who witnessed it. Allies who had doubted Rome's strength now marveled. Messages raced across the provinces, announcing that the conqueror of Gaul had crushed the son of Mithridates almost the moment he arrived. No prolonged campaign, no months of maneuver, just swift advance, sudden battle, decisive triumph. The Eastern threat, so alarming weeks earlier, had been annihilated in a single stroke. For Caesar, the result carried meaning far beyond Pontus. The victory reassured allies from Cappadocia to Bithynia that loyalty to him was safer than rebellion. Governors who had hesitated now sent envoys bearing tribute. Merchants reopened routes through the Black Sea, confident that Rome's grip was firm once again. Grain shipments resumed, silver flowed back into Roman treasuries, and the eastern frontier stabilized. The army, though exhausted, exulted in the triumph. Veterans compared the day at Zela with Alesia and Pharsalus, proud that they had once again defied odds. They feasted on captured stores, telling tales of the enemy's rout. Officers compiled reports, dispatching them westward to inform Rome of the outcome. The brevity of the campaign only heightened admiration. While others delayed with councils and preparations, Caesar had marched, fought, and conquered without pause. Rome received the news with awe. Senators still hostile muttered that fortune favored him unfairly, but even they admitted the brilliance of the result. Citizens in the Forum heard proclamations read aloud, marveling at how swiftly danger had been extinguished. Among the people, his reputation soared. Already hailed as a hero of Gaul and victor at Pharsalus, he now appeared unstoppable. The general himself wasted no time basking in glory. He knew civil war still raged. In Africa, Pompeian loyalists gathered under Metellus Scipio and King Juba of Numidia. In Hispania, sons of Pompey stirred rebellion. Egypt remained volatile despite Cleopatra's restoration. Every corner of the Roman world demanded attention. To linger in Anatolia would risk new crises. Within days of the triumph, Caesar moved west once more, leaving local governors to rebuild order. Later generations remembered this campaign for its brevity. Writers condensed it into a phrase that would echo through history: a declaration of speed and certainty. It captured the essence of the march, the battle, and the result in only a few words, a distillation of what had been achieved in days rather than months. Whatever the form of that message, the meaning was unmistakable. The conqueror of Gaul had entered, seen, and overcome without delay. By autumn, the eastern provinces lay secure. Pharnaces retreated into obscurity, his ambition broken. Cities once fearful now displayed Roman standards with pride. From the hills of Pontus to the harbours of the Aegean, all acknowledged that Caesar's authority stretched unchallenged. For his army, it was one more campaign completed, one more proof that fortune marched in their ranks. For the Republic, it was another step toward transformation, as victories abroad fed the power of a single man at home. With the east pacified, Caesar prepared to return west. Ahead lay the shores of Africa, where Pompey's allies plotted resistance. The war was not yet finished, but momentum pressed ever forward. Zela had closed one chapter with extraordinary swiftness, leaving the world in no doubt that Rome's fate rested in the hands of a commander who seemed incapable of delay, hesitation, or defeat. The dust of Zela had barely settled when Caesar turned his eyes westward. Pharnaces had been swept aside with astonishing speed, but the war for Rome's soul was not finished. Across the sea, in Africa, Pompey's allies had gathered. Metellus Scipio, bound by marriage into Pompey's family, commanded senatorial forces. Cato the Younger, incorruptible and unyielding, gave their cause moral weight. King Juba of Numidia, long hostile to Rome, brought elephants and fierce warriors to their banner. There, on the coast of modern Tunisia, a new front threatened to undo all Caesar had won. The general moved swiftly. From Asia Minor, he crossed into Italy, rallying veterans and raising new recruits. The city received him with relief and celebration, but his stay was brief. Grain ships from Africa fed Rome. To allow the Pompeians to control those harbours was intolerable. He spent the winter months gathering fleets and supplies, then sailed for the African coast. Storms scattered his ships, and many soldiers arrived without provisions. Yet the conqueror of Gaul pressed on, confident that speed and audacity could substitute for numbers. Africa was a hostile land. Dry winds blew across plains dotted with scrub, and the sun scorched men unused to such heat. The Pompeian camp stretched across fortified positions near Thapsus, a harbour town whose walls glimmered under relentless light. Scipio and Juba commanded tens of thousands, their ranks swollen by elephants that towered over Roman lines. The sight unsettled Caesar's recruits, many of whom had never faced such beasts. Memories of Hannibal's invasion centuries earlier haunted them. At first, the campaign staggered. Caesar's scattered fleet left his army undersupplied, and foragers were harassed by Numidian cavalry. Yet he established camps, built lines of communication, and rallied allies from nearby towns. Gradually, his veterans arrived in larger numbers, their presence steadying the new recruits. With each passing week, his strength grew, while the Pompeian commanders hesitated, reluctant to risk all in open battle. The stalemate ended in spring. Near Thapsus, the two armies arrayed themselves for a confrontation that would decide the African war. Scipio deployed his infantry in the center. Elephants massed on the flanks, Numidian cavalry poised for sweeping maneuvers. Juba's contingents added further weight, their banners bright beneath the sun. The sheer size of the host seemed overwhelming. Caesar's men, though fewer, stood in disciplined ranks, veterans of Gaul mingling with raw recruits. The battle opened with the thunder of elephants. Great beasts charged, tusks gleaming, towers swaying on their backs. Trumpets blared, and the ground shook beneath their advance. Roman soldiers braced, hurling javelins, thrusting spears, and beating shields to create walls of sound. Veterans aimed for eyes and bellies, places vulnerable despite thick hides. Some animals panicked, wheeling back into friendly lines, trampling their own infantry. Others pressed forward until they collapsed beneath a forest of spear points. The fearsome spectacle dissolved into chaos as beasts fell screaming, riders crushed under their weight. With the elephants broken, Caesar unleashed his legions. Cohorts surged forward, shields locked, blades stabbing with relentless rhythm. Trumpets signaled coordinated advances, and centuries of training bore fruit. The Pompeian center resisted, but pressure mounted. On the flanks, Numidian cavalry attempted to outmaneuver their opponents, yet Caesar's horsemen, though fewer, fought with stubborn determination, driving them back step by step. The clash grew desperate. Dust filled the air. Cries of the wounded mingled with the clash of steel. Caesar moved along the lines, urging steadiness, pointing where gaps appeared, committing reserves at critical moments. His soldiers, recalling his presence at Alesia and Pharsalus, fought with renewed vigor. Slowly, the Pompeian ranks buckled. Panic rippled through their line as cohorts broke and fled toward the camp. The rout became slaughter. Roman veterans, enraged by years of civil conflict, showed little mercy. Camps were stormed, fugitives cut down, bodies littering the plain. Ancient accounts describe a frenzy so intense that Caesar himself struggled to restrain his men. Tens of thousands perished, their corpses piling along the shore. The elephants that had once seemed invincible lay sprawled in grotesque heaps, tusks broken, towers shattered. The Battle of Thapsus ended in decisive victory, its outcome never again in doubt. Yet the aftermath carried a darker weight. Among the defeated was Cato the Younger, who had withdrawn to Utica with a small band of followers. Known for his austerity and unbending virtue, Cato refused to submit. As news of Thapsus reached him, he gathered friends and family, assuring them of his resolve. That night, he fell upon his sword, choosing death over submission. His passing sent shockwaves through Rome. Even Caesar, victorious and supreme, is said to have mourned. For though Cato opposed him fiercely, his integrity was unquestioned. The Republic had lost one of its last uncompromising voices. Caesar entered Africa's towns as master. Thapsus fell, Carthage bowed, and Numidia was subdued. King Juba took his own life, unwilling to be paraded in a Roman triumph. Metellus Scipio fled by sea, but met death in flight. The remnants of Pompey's cause in Africa were annihilated. The conqueror of Gaul now commanded every province from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. In Rome, the victory was greeted with jubilation. Crowds cheered as news of Thapsus arrived. Temples filled with sacrifices of thanksgiving, and coins were struck bearing symbols of elephants and victory. Yet beneath the celebration lay unease. Each triumph brought Caesar closer to unchecked supremacy. Senators who once plotted resistance now bowed in submission. Those who had fled were dead or in hiding. No rival remained strong enough to challenge him openly. The general himself returned to Italy with solemn purpose. His triumphs would be celebrated in dazzling processions, but he knew civil war was not yet fully extinguished. In Hispania, Pompey's sons had raised rebellion, and Caesar resolved to finish what he had begun. Still, the African campaign marked a turning point. With Thapsus, organized senatorial resistance was broken, and the Republic's fate bent irrevocably toward one man's authority. The fields around Thapsus lay silent when the armies departed. Corpses of men and beasts alike covered the ground, mute testimony to the scale of slaughter. Survivors told of the terror of elephants charging, of camps stormed, of comrades trampled and cut down. Rome remembered the battle as both decisive and merciless, a triumph won at terrible cost. Cato's death at Utica added a final, tragic note. To many Romans, he became a symbol of resistance, the last true republican who refused to live under domination. To Caesar, he was a foe who could have been spared, yet chose defiance even in defeat. His passing elevated him into legend, a reminder that victory in civil war carried not only power, but grief. For Caesar, the African campaign closed one chapter of struggle. Spain remained to be subdued, but the Senate's champions were no more. In the years since crossing the Rubicon, he had taken Italy without blood, forced surrender in Spain, crushed resistance in Greece, subdued Egypt, and now annihilated his enemies in Africa. Each campaign added weight to his authority, until resistance seemed futile. Yet with each triumph, the Republic slipped further from its old form. What began as rivalry between generals had become the rise of a single master. The Battle of Thapsus, fought beneath the African sun, stood not only as a military victory, but as a symbol of transition, the moment when organized opposition fell and Caesar's supremacy became undeniable. The African campaign had ended in slaughter, yet the flame of resistance did not die with Cato at Utica. Two sons of Pompey the Great, Gnaeus and Sextus, escaped across the sea to Hispania. There, in rugged provinces far from Italy's heart, they raised a final army against Caesar. Veterans loyal to their father, refugees from Thapsus, and Spanish levies swelled their ranks until they claimed more than 70,000 men. For Romans weary of war, the news was bitter. The Republic's struggle was not yet finished. Hispania offered ground well suited for rebellion. Mountains cut across the land, valleys concealed ambushes, and local communities had long memories of past Roman oppression. The Pompeian brothers played on these grievances, portraying themselves as avengers of their father and defenders of tradition. Gnaeus, the elder, spoke in fiery tones, promising that Caesar's tyranny would end on Spanish soil. Sextus, quieter but shrewd, secured supplies and organized fleets along the coast. Together, they created a power too great for Caesar to ignore. In early 45 BC, the conqueror of Gaul marched west. He had crushed rivals in Italy, Greece, Egypt, Pontus, and Africa, but now faced an enemy born of the same blood as Pompey. His legions, though seasoned, grumbled at the prospect of yet another campaign. Many had followed him for more than a decade, their bodies scarred, their purses heavy with spoils, longing for peace at last. Yet loyalty bound them. When Caesar called, they marched. The campaign was grueling. Hispania's terrain tested discipline as much as combat. Roads wound through mountain passes, rivers swelled with spring floods, and supplies moved slowly along rugged tracks. Pompeian forces harassed columns with cavalry raids, burning villages suspected of loyalty to Rome. Caesar pressed on, refusing to let fatigue slow him. He knew delay only strengthened his enemies, who drew confidence from each day of freedom. The decisive encounter came near the town of Munda in the south of Hispania. There, on rolling hills dotted with olive groves, the Pompeian army took position. Their numbers dwarfed Caesar's, and the high ground gave them advantage. From their camp, banners of Gnaeus and Sextus fluttered defiantly, symbols of a family not yet erased. Caesar surveyed the field with grim attention. For the first time since Pharsalus, he faced battle against an enemy equal in determination and nearly superior in numbers. The morning of March 17th dawned clear and cold. Pompeian cohorts lined the ridge, their shields glinting in the sun. Elephants from Numidia, survivors of Thapsus, stood once more at the flanks, though fewer than before. Cavalry clustered near the wings, eager to repeat the maneuvers that had failed at Pharsalus. In the valley below, Caesar drew up his veterans in tight formation. Standards rose, trumpets blared, and the armies advanced. The uphill struggle was brutal. Pompeian missiles rained down as Caesar's men climbed the slopes, shields raised against a storm of javelins and stones. Progress was slow, every step contested. Veterans gritted their teeth, recalling sieges in Gaul where walls had loomed just as daunting. The Pompeian brothers urged their men from the ridge, shouting promises of victory. For hours, the battle swayed with no side yielding. At the center, Caesar's cohorts wavered under pressure. The general himself rode forward, dismounting to fight among the ranks. His presence steadied them, reminding all that their fate and his were one. Slowly, with relentless drive, the line edged upward. On the wings, cavalry engagements raged, horse against horse, dust rising in choking clouds. Then the tide shifted. Caesar's right flank, pressing hardest, began to push back the Pompeian line. Exhaustion sapped the defenders on the ridge, their ranks thinning as casualties mounted. Once momentum broke, panic spread. Cohorts that had stood firm for hours turned and fled. The veterans of Caesar surged after them, discipline dissolving into ruthless pursuit. Pompeian cavalry scattered, elephants stampeded in confusion, and the ridge became a killing ground. The rout was total. Estimates of the dead ran into tens of thousands. Gaius escaped, but was soon captured and executed. Sextus slipped away, vanishing into obscurity for a time, though he would resurface later as a pirate king. For now, the Pompeian cause lay shattered. The field of Munda was carpeted with corpses, a final monument to resistance that had begun years earlier with the crossing of the Rubicon. The victory cost dearly. Caesar's own forces suffered heavy losses, greater than in any other battle of the civil wars. Even hardened veterans admitted the struggle had been desperate. For many, it proved the last fight of their lives. Survivors, though triumphant, marched away weary and hollow-eyed, aware they had destroyed not only their enemy, but their fellow Romans once again. In Rome, news of Munda spread with a mix of relief and exhaustion. Citizens who had feared endless war welcomed the end of organized resistance. Temples filled with offerings, markets reopened with confidence, and songs praised Caesar as master of the world. Yet unease lingered. The Senate, already reduced to compliance, now saw no alternative but submission. Dictatorship, once a temporary measure, began to look permanent. For Caesar, Munda secured his supremacy. No rival armies remained. The sons of Pompey were finished, Cato lay dead in Africa, and Pharnaces had been swept aside in the east. The Republic's long tradition of competition between aristocrats had collapsed into the dominance of one man. He prepared to return to Rome, not as equal among senators, but as ruler beyond challenge. The olive groves of Munda whispered of finality. There, among the hills of Hispania, the last serious opposition had been crushed. Veterans carried memories of the slaughter, recalling the desperate climb and the rivers of blood that followed. The civil wars, which had consumed the Republic since Caesar crossed the Rubicon, were at last concluded in decisive victory. The war in Hispania had ended, but the memory of Munda lingered in every legionary who had survived it. Olive groves stood silent over a field where Romans had cut down Romans until the earth ran red. It was the last battle of the civil wars, and its cost was heavy even in victory. When Caesar gathered his troops afterward, he looked upon men who were scarred, exhausted, yet unbroken. They had carried him from the forests of Gaul to the plains of Thessaly, through Egypt and Pontus, across Africa, and finally to Spain. Now, with the Pompeian cause extinguished, the march turned not toward another battlefield, but toward Rome itself. His return in late 45 BC unfolded with deliberate grandeur. From the moment he crossed into Italy, cities decorated their streets with garlands, magistrates offered keys at their gates, and crowds lined the roads. Veterans hobbled forward to salute, showing wounds still raw from years of campaigning. Farmers left their fields to glimpse the commander who had brought peace at last. In village after village, the reception was the same, jubilation mixed with awe. When he entered the capital, the scene reached its peak. Rome erupted in celebration. Trumpets blared, incense burned in the streets, and citizens hailed the conqueror of Gaul as master of the Republic. Triumph after triumph followed. Over several days, he paraded victories from a decade of war. Gaul subdued, Pharsalus won, Egypt tamed, Pontus crushed, Africa pacified, and Spain secured. Each procession displayed spoils and prisoners. Vercingetorix's broken standards, Egyptian treasures, chains of Pontic captives, African elephants, and Spanish banners passed before the people. Chariots glittered, musicians played, and feasts filled the city. The spectacle awed the crowds, but unsettled some senators. A single triumph was an extraordinary honor, but Caesar's processions blurred together into something more, a statement that he alone embodied Rome's power. As citizens cheered and coins were struck with his image, senators whispered uneasily in colonnades. The Republic's traditions, which had once balanced power among magistrates, seemed drowned in the flood of a single man's glory. After the celebrations, Caesar turned to reform. Years of civil war had left the Republic disordered, and he moved swiftly to restore stability on his terms. The calendar was reorganized into the system later called the Julian calendar, correcting errors that had long confused festivals and harvests. Colonies were established across Italy, Gaul, and Spain, settling veterans in fertile lands while relieving the crowded city. Debt laws were adjusted, easing burdens without erasing obligations entirely. Grain distribution was standardized, ensuring a steadier supply. The Senate itself was expanded. New members from Italy and even provincial towns were admitted, men once excluded from the Republic's highest council. To Caesar, this broadened representation and strengthened loyalty. To aristocrats, it diluted their prestige, yet they could do little to oppose it. Sessions were held in his presence, decrees issued at his suggestion, and magistrates chosen with his approval. The Senate still met, but its voice no longer guided Rome. It echoed the will of one man. Building projects reshaped the city. Plans were laid for new forums, temples, and libraries. Work began on the Forum of Caesar, a vast space meant to rival the Forum Romanum itself. Statues rose in his honor, some in temples traditionally reserved for gods. His likeness appeared on coins across the Mediterranean, the first living Roman to claim such prominence. In every corner of the empire, from the Euphrates to the Pillars of Hercules, Caesar's image marked authority. Yet even as he acted the statesman, he accepted honors that alarmed Republicans. He was appointed consul year after year, censor for life, and eventually dictator perpetuo, dictator without term. His chair in the Senate gleamed with gold. His body was guarded by lictors carrying axes within the pomerium, a symbol once forbidden. Festivals celebrated his name, and some proposed that he be worshipped among the gods. To many Romans, it seemed kingship in all but name, had returned. The people, however, felt stability. Markets reopened, farmers sold produce without fear of raids, and merchants sailed safely under Roman banners. Veterans found land to cultivate, and colonists spread across provinces, binding them more closely to Rome. For the urban masses, the dictator's rule meant grain distributions, festivals, and security. While aristocrats fumed, ordinary citizens praised the man who had ended years of chaos. Caesar himself dreamed beyond Rome. He spoke openly of a grand eastern campaign, a march into Parthia to avenge the disaster at Cari, where Crassus had fallen. Maps were drawn, supplies ordered, and legions readied. He intended to extend Rome's frontiers to the Persian Gulf, surpassing even Alexander in conquest. The war would begin in 44 BC, and he planned to leave within months. In private life, he entwined himself with Cleopatra. The Egyptian queen visited Rome with their son, Caesarion, causing whispers in every quarter. Some senators gnashed their teeth at the sight of her gilded barge on the Tiber, fearing that Caesar might one day crown her Queen of Rome. Others saw her as an exotic curiosity, a reminder that their city now commanded kingdoms once thought unreachable. Whatever the gossip, her presence signaled that Caesar's ambitions were not confined to Italy, but stretched across the known world. Yet beneath triumph and reform lay unease. Senators who had once fought against him at Pharsalus or Thapsus now sat in silence, pardoned yet humiliated. His clemency, praised by some, became a source of resentment for others who could not forgive the loss of their independence. Each honor he accepted, each statue raised, each decree passed in his name, deepened suspicion that liberty itself was dying. The atmosphere in Rome grew tense. Some courtiers placed crowns upon his statues, hinting at monarchy. At one festival, a diadem was offered in public. Though he pushed it aside, the gesture inflamed fears that he longed for kingship. Old men muttered that Tarquin had returned in new guise. Younger senators whispered in corners, speaking of daggers and duty. Still, daily life in the city thrived. Gladiatorial games dazzled, theatres bustled, and new buildings rose from the dust. For the common people, Caesar's rule meant abundance and entertainment. For aristocrats, it meant submission. Two visions of Rome coexisted uneasily, one of prosperity under a master, the other of liberty fading under dictatorship. By the start of 44 BC, Caesar held more power than any Roman in memory. He had remade the calendar, filled the Senate with his appointees, settled veterans across the provinces, and planned conquests that would carry Roman banners to the Parthian frontier. Crowds hailed him as bringer of peace, merchants thrived under stability, and soldiers dreamed of new wars under his command. Yet every triumph deepened the silence in the Curia. Senators who once competed as equals now sat as spectators, their pride cut away by his honors. Statues crowned with diadems whispered of monarchy, and the old hatred of kings stirred again. The people adored him, the aristocracy seethed. Rome glittered with festivals, games, and monuments, but beneath the marble streets, resentment hardened into conspiracy. Men he had spared after Pharsalus now gathered in secret, swearing that liberty would not outlive his ambition. And so, as Caesar stood at the height of glory, master of Rome, reformer of its calendar, victor of every battlefield, the shadows lengthened. He believed the Republic secure in his hands. But in the Senate House, daggers were already being sharpened. His triumph was complete, yet so too was the circle of fate that would soon close around him.